On today's World Insight, countdown to U.S. President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration with big challenges, the pandemic and tanking economy awaiting his first days in office. How smooth could the transition of power be? And the pandemic has fundamentally altered the financial landscape. Insights from Ann Richards, the CEO of global investment firm Fidelity International, about what the new normal in investments looks like.
So you've seen financial companies, technology companies in particular, do very well as the world has adapted the style of work.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We start with a look at the latest on the U.S. transition of power. President-elect Joe Biden will sign a flurry of executive orders in his first days in the office to roll back some of Trump's controversial policies. They include repealing the travel ban of citizens from some majority Muslim countries to the U.S., rejoining the Paris Climate Change Accord, extending nationwide restrictions on eviction and foreclosures, and enacting a mask mandate on federal property. The move comes after Biden unveiled a $1.9 trillion U.S. plan to revive the pandemic-hit U.S. The waning days of Trump's presidency, the sitting president and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tried to lock in a tough approach to China before Biden takes office. With the challenges of a public health crisis, virus-ravaged economy, racial strife, and political polarization, how might Biden overcome all of these ideological divisions and get bipartisan support to push his legislative agenda through Congress? Let's loop in our panelists to find out. For the latest on the U.S. politics, joining us in Chicago, Laura Schwartz, a political commentator who worked at the White House during the Clinton era. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, a professor of political science at the University of Iowa. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Wu Xinbo, director at the Center for American Studies. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the program. Let me begin by asking our two American guests about the latest politics in Washington. It's changing day by day, probably hour by hour. Ms. Schwartz, you experienced the earlier time of impeachment for President Clinton. How would you compare the circumstances then and now? What does that mean for the schedule, if there is going to be anyone, after the inauguration?
Well, it's very interesting and such a smart question, Tian, because really during the Clinton administration, that was an impeachment of President Clinton that we had to really see through every day and speak about the message and the policy for the American people, while Capitol Hill did their work on the impeachment. Now, even though Joe Biden is not the one being impeached, he still is going to be under a cloud of impeachment. So with his rigorous schedule and his commitment to get so much done in the first 100 days of his presidency, he too has to see through the impeachment and speak, and I would suggest daily, to the American people about what he's doing to stay true to the very platform of which he was elected to enact. While at the same time, Donald Trump himself will have to gather his legal team. And because the impeachment has already passed in the House, meaning they brought the charges, and it will go on to the Senate soon. We don't know exactly when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, will transmit those articles. But once they do, the Senate tries the president. And so he's going to have to present a defense as well. So Donald Trump is not going quietly off into the night. He's got a lot to do to prepare to fight this impeachment as well.
How were the time when you were in the White House spending with the other members of the team to deal with an impeachment against the President Clinton? And of course, we know this is uncomparable, what is going on with that trial and what is going on likely with the content of the Donald Trump. But what was it like to be a member of the team that has been impeached?
Well, we were determined, not knowing how long the Senate was going to take. And for President Clinton, I believe there were 4 or 5 articles of impeachment. And Professor Hagel may know that for sure. It was either 4 or 5 articles. So it was a longer trial. This is just one article of impeachment, the incitement of an insurrection. So it may be shorter in duration, but regardless, it can be just as harmful, like I said, for a Biden presidency trying to get things done as it would have been for a Trump presidency midterm. We all were pretty devastated when the House had the majority vote to impeach. But it was because we followed President Clinton's lead, which was that every day he told us, listen, impeachment in the Senate's going to come and go. And they're going to be hard on me. They're going to say terrible things. But you know what? I'm going to need to work with every single one of them after this is over, because we've got this on the table. We've got education. We got welfare. And that's how I think he got through it himself, and how he really riled the rest of us to do it as well, because there were very dark days when you're trying to get your message out and talk about what you're doing, but you can't even get to the front or the second page of the newspaper. And in this 24-hour news cycle, you want to do as much as what you can as the party that's getting snuffed out. To just try to break through a little every day. That's what we did every day. We got up just with the goal of getting on the second or third page of the paper. And that's what Biden's team is going to have to do, too.
Professor Hagel, your name is being mentioned by your colleagues, so let me come to you about that. How do you compare the situation, and as a result, the timetable, possibly, of the trial at the Senate?
You know, it's so hard to tell. This really is unprecedented, not only because it's a second impeachment, but because of the fact that Trump's going to be out of office. Some people have argued, including law professor Jonathan Turley, suggesting that Trump shouldn't even bother to put on a defense, basically suggesting that the point of impeachment is to remove somebody from office, and he's no longer in office. So why should they bother even putting on a defense? Now, I don't know if the Senate Republicans would try to put on a defense for him or whatever, or maybe they would simply try to say, well, it's a moot point. And so it's possible that if a trial goes forward, that Trump could then go to court and say, well, look, this isn't appropriate. Now, normally the courts won't touch an impeachment situation because it's a political question, but under this circumstance, it may be because it's a due process or not following procedure properly that they would be willing to step in and basically say, okay, you can't be doing this.
It's not just Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, the current and the future majority leader in the Senate, that have to agree with one another, but also members of the Senate. They have to be on the same page, which means if they start a trial, they will have to be there every day for the afternoon trial, while in the morning dealing with the heavy agenda coming from the new administration. So, Professor Hagel, do you think the political environment is ripe for that, given the division?
That's the other thing that's quite different from the 90s when Clinton was impeached. Again, even though things were very tense at that particular time, they're nothing like they are today, unfortunately. We're in an era of hyper-partisanship, and although there are some Republican members who would be willing to perhaps cross over, maybe not on the impeachment, we'll have to see, although we certainly saw that in the House where some 10 members did vote for impeachment. I'm not sure if any senators would as well. We'll have to wait and see if it comes to a vote. But senators like Romney, Sass, Collins, Murkowski, they're all ones that might be willing to work with Democrats, especially on legislative matters of one sort or another. And then we have to look and see, well, who's up for re-election in 2022, who's from a state that's they're perhaps a swing state or a state where they might be vulnerable. And so there's the politics obviously is going on aside from the particular partisanship of the impeachment.
Professor Wu Xinbo from China, I know we are all observing this from afar while the U.S. is going through this insurrection, inauguration, and impeachment. What is your take, given the fact that you have been observing America issues in China for decades?
Well, this is a very unique time in my observation of the U.S. politics in the last several decades. especially given the legacy Trump leaves. Actually, this country is now in political divide and antagonism, social chaos, and strain. And most important of all is still in a serious public health crisis. Every day, thousands of people died from COVID-19, largely because of the disastrous handling of the challenge by the Trump administration. So this is really unprecedented in the United States history, in its modern history. And also think about the power transition. To some extent, Trump so far still has not conceded his defeat and admitted the victory for Biden. So there's still an uncertainty about what's going on January 20th. And FBI has already warned that there may be protests and violent protests in all the 50 states on January 20th. If now from what we can see on TV in Washington, D.C., it's just like a kind of in a war zone, it's a war situation. So that is really unprecedented. Mm-hmm. So that is a very challenging time for Biden administration and for America as well.
We see the Biden administration is already having a huge piles of tasks, $1.9 trillion to begin with the vaccination, economic recovery, and several other fronts. Meanwhile, on the very first day of his office, right after inauguration, he might want to sign executive orders going back into WHO, climate change, issues like that. So, Ms. Schwartz, what is your assessment of the workload of this president, given both what he needs to do and given the political atmosphere in Washington right now?
Yeah, Tian, Professor Wu mentioned just the amount of collaboration, honestly, that has to come as a result of crisis. And when you look at that COVID relief package that Biden put forward last week at $1.9 trillion, that's a big price tag. And inside of it is child care, it's job assistance, it is helping people stop from being evicted from their homes, it's a minimum wage, and it's getting vaccines into an arm, not just out to the states, but a national cohesive effort to help them get them into arms where it counts. I really think that that's where, and from what we've heard and from whom I've spoken with inside the Biden transition, they've reached out to some of those senators to talk about this in a bipartisan way. There's a lot in that $1.9 trillion that both Republicans and Democrats alike have spoken about, including adding an additional $1,400 of assistance that would make it to that $2,000 that President Trump himself was calling for at the end of the year. So I think it's finding collaboration where you can, and certainly when it comes to the pandemic and the economy, that can be done by consensus. A lot of hard work, but it can. And then executive orders, as you mentioned, rejoining the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, turning back the ban on Muslims. There are things that he can do by executive order that will be swift and will follow through on campaign promises. So you're going to see a pretty good balance of both. Yeah. But you've got to have a bipartisan consensus, especially in 100 days, to prove to the American people, listen, this is what I said I would do. This is what the 81 million Americans voted for me to do, and I'm going to do it.
Given someone who have served in the administration, what do you think might be the best way for this administration to approach both parties?
You find your allies across the aisle. As Professor Hagel said earlier, and we've been echoing, the Senate is a bit more measured from the conservative Republican, not the Trumpian Republican, but the more conservative Republican base. And that's where Joe Biden is familiar. And that's where Joe Biden has to reach, so that if he has an event in the Rose Garden at the White House, and I hope he does on the second day of the administration, it shouldn't just be surrounded by Democrats. He's got to bring in a Republican for every. When I was the White House director of events, I had a rule. if we were going to have a Democratic member of the Senate, we needed to have a Republican as well.
No, very
because you have to show a collaboration. Now, some days it's harder than others, but I really hope they do make that a priority of theirs. That's how you get things done.
Professor Hagel, though, if you look at what's going on in the countries, not just what Washington is doing, but also the localities, you see different states also divided, as we have already witnessed. And there are those who are coming out and trying to accuse those who have not voted yes for Trump impeachment. So how do you see that bringing together the consensus that Laura mentioned possible?
Well, as she indicated, and it's a very good point, is you have to seek your allies or find where you can find some common ground with certain people who maybe aren't utterly opposed to whatever your policies are. And that's where even though there are going to be Republicans who maybe aren't real strong in favor of Trump, are a little concerned about the price tag of $1.9 trillion and have been concerned about the price of a lot of things in the Trump administration, maybe are now going to put their foot down, so to speak. But what you have to look at are things that I usually refer to as the kitchen table issues. Try to forget about or not emphasize the partisan politics that are going on, because a lot of people, especially people in the middle, the independents, they don't care about that stuff. They aren't paying attention to that stuff. And in fact, it turns them off to a great extent. What they do care about, particularly in the environment we're in now, is the economy, how we're dealing with not only the pandemic, but the economic fallout from the pandemic. And so they need that help. Those businesses, small businesses need that help. Individuals need an extra $1,400. And maybe some will argue that that's not enough, but at least it's something to get them through another month or another few weeks.
Right. On the other hand, the Republican Party, isn't it, Professor Hagel, also have to come to consensus, given what Trump did within the Republican Party. How much difficulty do you see that the party itself needs to come to realize what they need to do next?
My guess is he's not going to just quietly fade away like most presidents do. Obama basically did, George W. Bush basically did, Carter did a lot of public service sorts of things, but these presidents really didn't get involved in politics too much after they left office. With Trump, he's a fighter, he's unhappy with the result, he's a media guy, he always was. He was before he ran for office, and so it's very possible that he's going to try to stay in the spotlight, and it's very possible that people want him to stay in the spotlight because he is such a divisive figure and he gets a lot of media attention. If that's the case, then those divisions within the Republican Party are going to continue, making it more difficult for them to find some issues to coalesce around. They might be able to do it, especially again on the economic side of things and dealing with the pandemic and the economy.
Right.
But, if it's the political stuff, they're going to remain divided, and that's going to be good news for Democrats in the next 2- and 4-year elections.
Interesting. Once the president-elect becomes the president, a lot of corrections can be done about the wrong directions of foreign policy, international approach by Washington right now. Professor Wu, how realistic and pragmatic do you think those hopes could be from this part of the world?
I think the general expectation is that Biden will first and foremost try to reach out to allies and friends so that to consolidate the U.S. Position in the world and regain the influence it has lost during the Trump years. So I think that is something on the high agenda, a priority for Biden's foreign policy agenda. And also, we are going to see Biden to get back to some of the international mechanisms that Trump decided to work out, especially Paris Agreement. And also, it's likely the U.S. is going to return to the Iran nuclear deal, and will stop the process of creating World Health Organization. I think these things are the priorities for Biden's foreign policy, and it's going to happen. And also, I think his team will need some internal examination about the legacy of Trump's China policy. Just see how much damages Trump has done to China-U.S. relationship. Huge challenges for Biden.
even during the last few days of this administration, we see some administration officials trying to lay down one hurdle after another for the next administration coming in to improve any kinds of relationship with China. Now, Professor Wu, did China understand this? And how will China work with positive messages, if there were any, coming from the new administration at the very beginning of their term in the White House?
Well, I think this kind of barriers that Trump administration has been trying to build up in the last days of the administration is not just politically driven. I think sometimes it's also psychologically driven. Some people, including Pompeo, I think they really hate China. So they just want to express his anger and to some extent frustration with China by taking this kind of crazy actions. I think Biden, on the one hand, he needs to talk about China as a major competitor to the United States and appears to be tough on China. But on the other hand, he understands the necessity of working with China on a wide range of issues of his concern, a wide range of issues of U.S. interests. So he may need some time to figure out the agenda, but I think China certainly has some expectation that under Biden administration, there will be more opportunities and room for cooperation.
And finally, before we go, there's another issue about whether a president will be able to pardon himself. That is a huge debate inside the U.S. politics right now. Ms. Schwartz, how do you see that? And what do you make of the consistent effort by the current president to do so?
Well, you know, President Trump has certainly wondered about a pardon for himself, not just with his advisories, but out loud. And it's something that constitutional scholars have been debating. They can look back to different rulings or readings and writings to say, listen, one cannot be the jury of themselves, and that the pardon privilege would not extend to the president himself. Now, it looks like there's a couple of advocates surrounding the president saying, yes, you can do it, sir, you should go ahead. But the majority around him say, listen, you try to pardon yourself, you're going to look more guilty, especially going into an impeachment proceeding, and you're going to be challenged by the courts. Do you really want that? So I think it's getting less likely. I have to tell you, Tian, maybe about 2-3 weeks ago, before the insurgents in the Capitol, I would have said it was 80% likely Trump would try to pardon himself and probably be able to do it. Now I think that's more 20 to 30% at this point.
Interesting. Professor Hagel, what is the process for a president to pardon himself before he leaves office, and what do you make about that possibility for Trump?
Well, I don't know that we know what the process would be other than how we would pardon anybody else and basically say, okay, you know, any crimes, federal crimes that you had committed that you cannot be charged with. And essentially President Ford did as much for President Nixon. I would say, though, that a couple of things. First, it's not clear that, at least at a federal level, that Trump's broken any laws. People talk about the incitement to riot and so forth, but what he said at that particular event doesn't seem to satisfy the advocacy of violation of the law criteria of immediacy and likelihood. So it may be that he really doesn't need to. He also can't pardon himself for any potential state crimes. And we know that the Attorney General of the state of New York is looking into Trump's financial dealings. And so that's something he can't do as president, pardon himself for that. I would also say that if, in fact, there is any federal crimes that are committed, it might be a good idea, and a few people have mentioned this, for Biden to simply pardon the president, just to get it out of his hair, out of the way, and so forth. Now, again, that may not work because Trump is Trump, but still, it would help to soften perhaps a lot of people if we don't have to go through some sort of trial of an ex-president, which would then be, again, a media circus taking away from the Biden administration.
What an interesting situation. Unprecedented, I would say. And certainly, with your help and your insights, we understand it much better. Thank you so much, the three of you, Laura Schwartz, Tim C. Hagel, and Wu Xinbo.